Okay, good evening. All right, so 99% of our scientists believe that climate change science is now settled. Australian public is not quite at those levels. I've chosen a graph by the Lowy Institute poll that surveyed Australians over the last decade to show that our attitudes towards climate change has gone up and down. In the 1990s, Australia was one of the most informed in terms of climate change, and then the situation changed, as Susan mentioned. But in the last few years, it has reversed, and more people are believing in climate change science and also believing that serious action needs to be taken. So as at 2018, 60% of Australians believed that climate change was a serious problem and needed addressing. So in terms of what do we know about the people who don't believe in climate change science? First of all, the figure shows that Australia is quite different to a number of other countries. So when we compare the beliefs, the climate change concerns of Australia compared to many other OECD countries, Netherlands in this graph is the only one who believes less in climate change. The graph shows average climate change concern against gross net income per capita, and basically the richer a country, in general, the less likely they are concerned about climate change being a world problem that must be dealt with. So meta-analyses of trying to understand, what drives climate change attitudes, it basically tells us that climate change deniers are older. They are more likely to be older, male, less educated, wealthier, both at an individual household level, but also at the country level, as you can see in the graph. Caucasian, follow a conservative political ideology, and one of the most important impacts is they're less likely to have observed long-term changes in weather in their local environment. And I'm going to come back to that at the end in terms of some of the policy responses that we can look at. So that's the Australian public. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Australian farmers and why their beliefs towards climate change is important, and it's important to look at. I've been studying farmers and behaviour change for a number of decades now, and what a number of studies show is that farmers are up to 4 times more likely to deny climate change science than the average public. So this is important because, especially in Australia, farmers' beliefs have driven Nationals' policy towards climate change, and we know that Nationals' policy has influenced the Liberals' policy towards climate change. Now, the figure on the right basically illustrates that there seems to be a change happening in what farmers believe about climate change, and also believe that significant action must be taken. In 2010, only a third of farmers believed in climate change, but 5 years later there was a significant increase, up to 44% of farmers now stating that they believe climate change was a real and pressing problem for Australia. So this is a much faster rate of increase than the change within the Australian public. There's been lots of other different policy changes as well, with farmers starting to demand a much more sophisticated and strong climate change policy by Australia. So agriculture is often thought about as the forgotten industry, and an industry that can't really deal with trying to deal with climate change. I think we can be a bit more positive. I think agriculture can play a significant role. And in 2 areas, sequestration and mitigation. So mitigation, one of the reasons agriculture is often thought to be put in the too hard basket is because most of agricultural emissions come from methane, which is, for example, cows burping and farting. So that's often thought to be very difficult to actually deal with. But there's increased science work that's being done, for example, feeding cows seaweed, which can reduce methane emissions by up to 80%, and also changing other diets, various fats, etc., that can also reduce emissions up to 20%. So there's work being done in our scientific community about how agriculture can reduce its emissions in that space. In terms of sequestration, we could put a lot more tougher land clearing legislation in part, which would play a large role in sequestering carbon. And the picture in the middle basically is showing soil carbon over a period of 3 years from a farm in Victoria. So this is really, really exciting news. Well, I get excited by it. On 14th of March 2019, a regenerative farm in Victoria was the first farm to be given Australian carbon credit units under a soil carbon project under the Emissions Reduction Fund. This is the first worldwide. This farm was independently verified. They increased their soil carbon by 1% annually, and they got a credit of up to 11.2 tonnes of CO2 per hectare. There's other research overseas that suggests that soils can sequester up to 60 tonnes of CO2. So there's a lot that agriculture can play in this space. So just in summary, why is Australia a slow mover on climate change policy? Well, we know that policy is predominantly made by white, wealthy, male, middle-aged politicians who do not feel at risk from climate change. So that's one factor. We also know that Australia's natural resources and coal exports have meant there's a lot of vested interest in maintaining the status quo, and this definitely came into play from the mid-90s onwards. And this has led to government failure and regulatory capture. Economists have written about this considerably, and this is something that is actually very serious and one reason why we can't get change in climate change. One example, The Guardian published New South Wales ministers' meetings from 2014 to 2018 about who they met with, and basically it found, one of the findings was the New South Wales Minerals Council met ministers once a week over the 4-year period, and they had up to 10 times more access to ministers than environment, scientific, NGO groups. So that's just an example of regulatory capture.
Thank you, Sarah. So my job is to ask your questions for you. So Sarah, is there a difference in people's attitudes to climate change and their pro-environmental behaviours, and what can be done about the gap, especially for climate deniers?
Yes, so we know that the more a person believes in climate change and the more they're concerned about it, we know that this does drive a series of pro-environmental and climate change behaviour. So it is a positive influence, but there is a gap. There is a significant gap between what people believe and how they behave. Work that I've been doing is also trying to establish, is there a link by once people behave in a certain way, is there a feedback loop from behaviour to attitudes? And what we find, it really can depend on A, the type of behaviour, and B, the type of person. So, for example, for an environmentally motivated household, the more that they undertake really expensive mitigation behaviour, we can actually detect a decrease in their climate change concerns because, in a sense, they felt that they've done a part of their work. But it doesn't happen in every household and different types of households. For farmers, we actually find something different. So the more that climate change attitudes do influence farm adaptation, especially in terms of water scarcity and other adaptation measures on farm. But what we find is there is a positive feedback loop between if we can get farmers to undertake certain types of climate change actions, it can then positively influence on their attitudes, and then their attitudes positively influence on their behaviour. So again, it is a complex story, the link between attitudes and behaviour. In terms of what can be done about the gap, especially for climate change deniers, well, at the broad level, we could talk about this for a very long time, but we have to seek transparency and good governance as much as possible. We have to encourage diverse, more female membership of political parties to try and get change. And at the individual consumer and farmer level, not one measure is going to actually drive behavioural change all the way through. So we need a combination of education, science, regulation, remove subsidies, improve pricing, carbon tax, improve incentives to behavioural change. And most importantly, one of the things I think when we're talking about education is we must emphasise the local impacts of climate change on people's surrounding environment over time. So this is one of the most important things. The more that we can emphasise how much someone's local environment has changed, that seems to be one of the significant factors in changing climate change deniers into being climate change believers.